Got it. We're recording. You guys, I want to welcome a good friend of mine. Kent Parks is here with us today, and he is going to share here in the first little bit, and then we'll give you guys some time to ask him some questions. But Kent is the man. If you guys haven't met Kent yet, you will be glad that you met Kent today. Should call him Dr. Kent Parks. He's got a PhD in missions, and he is Stan's brother. But he will tell you he doesn't always agree with Stan. So we'll try to get him to disagree with Stan at some point on this call, believe it or not. But a couple things about him. He is the president and CEO of Beyond. If you haven't heard of Beyond, beyond.org, you want to check them out. He'll talk more about it. But it's a mission sending agency, and I have the privilege of being on the board there. And it is one of the few agencies that I know of that is fully committed to movements. We have sent, several different missionary teams, and we send all of our teams with Beyond now. We've sent with other agencies. There's a lot of great agencies out there, but they're not all exclusively focused on catalyzing movements where they send their workers, and Beyond is. So you guys want to know Kent and Beyond. A couple cool things about Kent. Let me let Mark in here. Kent's dad was the president of the IMB. I don't know if you guys knew that. Stan and Kent's dad was the president years ago, and it'd be a long story, but he, in the early days of David Watson and Curtis Sargent and some of these guys, when they were with the Southern Baptist Convention, Keith Parks, Kent's dad, backed them in what they were doing overseas. It's a great story we'll have to tell you more about soon. But Kent is really on the front lines of movement activity around the world. And so I asked Kent if he would just come and share some of what he's learning, and also maybe encourage us as we're beginning to look to catalyze movements, and then tell us how we can be involved with Beyond. Because at our church, we're committed to allowing Beyond to help us mobilize people to go to the field. And then we're sending long-term workers with Beyond, again, because we wanted to partner with a sending agency that was focused on movements wherever we were sending people. And you guys probably surprised you, we send most people to Thailand. Okay. I was gonna say everybody, it was not quite everybody. It was most people we send to Thailand, and Beyond helps us do that. So Kent, we are so glad that you're here today, and you're among friends. So I know they'll love hearing from you. Take your time and share, and then we'll probably have some questions for you.
Well, sure appreciate that, Chris. I'll pay you later for the nice things said.
Yeah.
So it is a great privilege to be with you guys today. And there's some amazing and exciting things happening around the world in movements. You need to know, one of my presuppositions is no individual believer or disciple or church is completely effective unless they're simultaneously focused on the whole world mission. Now, that's impossible for the individual in one sense, but nothing's impossible with God. And so when a church says, we're all in on our area and the rest of the world simultaneously. And as you would know, much of the Christian history that we've had for 2,000 years is a sequentialism. We'll do Jerusalem, and when we get done, we'll go somewhere else. And that's never worked. So I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. And my wife and I, Erica and I, served for 20 years in Indonesia, working among Muslims. If we had known in the first half of our career there what we knew in the second half, we'd have been a lot more effective. We began to be effective. And then this organization came and asked us to come lead them. And I told them no twice over the course of a year. And the Lord had other plans. And so we went through a change process. And it took a while, and it was harder than I thought. I couldn't figure out why people wouldn't get it and get excited. But once we finally made the turnaround, and now we're completely focused on catalyzing movements, would be our shorthand. Since 2013, when we finished retraining, the initial retraining, and started focusing, we've seen over 77,000 churches, and that's an absolutely low number. I probably legitimately, the mid-range number is 100,000 churches since 2013. We know 30 churches that had started by 2013. So that gives you an idea of what's happened. Let me give you a global glimpse of what's happening globally, just real quickly. Chris suggested I share 2 or 3 things, and without thinking real hard, I came up with 7 stories, but we won't get them all. Let me give you the bad news real briefly, and you know this. We've lost ground since the mid-'80s. There are about 1 billion more people who have no access to the gospel than had no access to the gospel in the 80s. And so with all of our traditional mission and church approach, we've gone backwards. Long discussion on that. The good news is there are movements breaking out, not breaking out, it's intentionally done in many, many places. Let me highlight just a couple of them to get us started, and you probably have heard this from Chris or Stan or others. But one of the movements we're involved in, we call it the listening movement. They really have taught many of us much more about listening to God on a detailed way. And in 2012, the guy who had started 12, the Indian guy who's really kind of the core, he and his brother kind of the core catalyst, came in for a training. He'd started 12 churches. He'd started a Bible school. He thought, what can this guy teach me? He'll tell you that. I've heard him say it in front of this guy named Steve. And the Lord, in literally 10 minutes, he says, without going into the whole story, completely blew his paradigm apart. And he wrote down in his notebook somewhere in that first month or so, the Lord's called us to reach all of North India. Steve will tell you he began to, over the course of months, he tried to, well, now, let's get started where we are. And, maybe the vision's too big. And finally, Steve said, the Lord told him, Steve, hush. I've told him that. Quit telling him I didn't tell him that. The short of it is, from that's end of 2012, 2013 early, that movement is now at least 50,000 churches in 9 states of India, in 200 caste groups, you might call them people groups, in at least 3 major religions, Hinduism, obviously, Islam, and Sikhism. Those would be the well-known religions. They're impacting some other smaller religions. And they're just continuing to, about a year and a half ago, I was telling people from their reports, they're in 5 states. They're now in 9 states in like a year and a half. And so let me highlight 2 stories, that one from early on, one kind of midway, and then I guess I'll highlight a 3rd story, just to use this movement as kind of a model. It helps us understand some of the stages of movement. Back in 2013, they had learned, look for people of peace. They had learned to, do Shema, word and deed that is spiritually fragrant, that attracts but does not force spiritual response. And all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, after a few months, they had 250 believers in 25 villages. They were in DBSs. All of them have said, we're ready to be committed completely to Jesus. What do we do? They said, well, study these passages about baptism. We're ready. We're committed. So Steve and Robin, his wife, and the core team at that time, about 8 Indian guys, they're really more family than team. They said, all right, what should we do? And everybody in the room except Steve, by the way, is an engineer. Everybody in the room said, what we'll do is we'll rent a small pavilion in a central village. We'll help pay everybody, all of the 25 groups to come in. We'll have a nice big meal together, and then we'll baptize them. And everybody's all excited, and the buzz was in the room, and Steve said no. And that's very unusual, because Steve's a very soft-spoken guy. So what do you mean no? You don't believe in baptism? He said, if the moment we do that, we've stopped reproduction. Now remember, there have been no baptisms in this initial effort yet. He said, the moment we do that, we show them you have to wait till you have a certain number of people, you have to have money to bring everybody together, and you have to have a centralized group do it. And so they went back and said, Lord, what should we do? And the Lord told them very clearly, send 2 to each village. And Steve and Robin were not the 2. It was always the Indian guys. And, go through, do a DBS again on baptism. When people are ready, the 2 of you baptize 1 person, maybe 2 at the most, depending on the family construct. And then they and others in that group baptize everybody else. And Steve said, the moment we don't do it the way we want it to end up, we've stopped it from ending up the way we want it to end up. And so that was very key. They begin to get to third and fourth generation growth. This is the mid-level story. This team of 7, 8 Indian guys, really sharp, Steve and Robin, they're trying to figure out how to handle this thing that's getting beyond the ability of this handful of folks. And a movement leader from Ethiopia came in. Stan actually brought him in to meet with several others, and they were a few steps ahead in movements. And he sat down and mainly listened to these guys for about a day and probed and asked and fellowshiped. And finally, Aichi said, the Ethiopian guy said, all right, my suggestion to you, he said, what we've learned to do is, he said, I feel like you're doing what we used to do. You have your leadership structure as a triangle. He said, you need to turn it into a circle. And he flattened his hands like this instead of like this. He said, turn it from a triangle into a circle and reproduce leadership circles at every generation. And that's what they've done. So the second generation cluster of churches, or this stream of the second generation cluster, would have a leadership team. And they would pray and they would ask the Lord how to use money or whatever it was. So that was very, very significant. And let me just stop there with those two stories. Like I said, there's so many amazing things happening, but let me stop and see if there are any questions or if you want me to take it another direction.
No, Kent, that's great. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions as you've been hearing Kent share about any of these stories that he's sharing?
Hey, Kent, knowing that you're talking to not everybody, but a lot of North American leaders that are on this call, what do you think are some of the greatest obstacles for us in decentralizing leadership and empowering the people? Because we've grown up most of us in models where that's just not how it's done. Any tools you can give us or ideas, thoughts?
Yeah, you keep casting vision. The reason I'm chuckling is we're having to, we're having to do the same thing with some of our leaders in our organization, although we're way down the road on movement thinking. We've changed some leadership structures and some people are still going, no, wait, we got to keep this part. And I think part of it is to do that vision casting, examining what do we see Scripture showing us with leadership. For instance, Paul's with about 30, someone did a study or, a quick analysis, about 30 different team configurations. So how did he do that? How come it's usually 2, 3, or 4 that you see Paul with in different settings and ongoing relationships? How come half of Paul's letters, if you take Scripture very seriously, are co-authored? It's not just politeness that he includes Silas and Timothy and others, Sylvanus at one point, another phrasing. So I think part of it is to help people see that pattern. But yeah, it is very, very difficult. And some of it is you and I are going to have to refuse to do some things that people would want us to do. And that is hard. I was doing something a while ago and my wife, who's very wise, said, why are you doing that? You could do it, but you need to let so-and-so do that and let them do their job and quit jumping in. I'm like, okay. So I think part of it is leadership has to model sitting there helping someone else lead, even if we could do it ourselves. Mm-hmm. Those are a couple of my quick answers, but yeah, it's definitely a difficult challenge because we're so patterned.
Hey, Mark, you next, then David, you after Mark. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know why I didn't catch this, but I'm kind of thinking if you could go over that triangle versus the circle again. I think I know what you're talking about, the 1, 3, 9, as you go down, everybody has to, I think that's what you mean by the triangle, but maybe I'm not on the same page or wavelength. Could you explain the difference between the triangle and the circle?
Sure. So I'll give a specific example that I know happened. Early on, if the only funding they used was for equipping. So they would help get a trainer or two to a place. They might fund the simple food, but that was, well, early on, that was Steve, and the public name we used for the guy is Sanjay and his brother John, and 2 or 3 others. They'd make that decision on how to divide that fund. We have $1,000, we have $500. how are we going to divide it up? Which trainings are we going to do? And so it came from a core of leadership, and all of a sudden they're trying to make decisions 2 and 3 generations down. And I don't even like the term down, 2 and 3 generations across. What they did is, after this meeting with Aichi, Steve actually pulled himself out of the process. He would say to the leadership core, the Sanjay and these guys who are really the core guys, all right, y'all got there's $1,000 that can be used for training. You have 3 generations, you guys decide. And so what they began to do is they would say to this, and it wasn't always just a singular circle, but let's say this 2nd generation circle of leaders, kind of the Bible, I think, kind of would use the phrase elders here. All right, for the 2nd generation churches, you guys have $200 for equipping. You ask God how you're going to divide it up. And they would go around the circle, and Brent would say, well, I think we have this big project and we're praying about it. And Chris would say, and this and this and this, and everybody listened to each other. And then in the power of the circle, people say, well, I think our project's really, really significant, but you know what? I think Jim's project is what the Lord's want us to fund, or these 3 projects. And that circle, that 2nd generation circle, divided up the money. They didn't have to ask permission from Sanjay and Steve and the others. They were given complete prerogative to listen to the Lord, decide together, and there was not one leader of the circle. Does that help?
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much. Mark, is that good? That help? Good.
Yes.
David, go ahead.
So this kind of piggybacks, Kent, on the same questions that you've been already talking about. But as I hear these stories, I mean, and kind of like Brent said, so many of us are North American pastors in legacy churches where, I mean, just those 2 stories, it's like opens my mind to how many other little cultural pieces like that are a part of our churches. And so my question is, have you worked with any North American context churches that have been able to kind of deconstruct themselves, so to speak, to get to a much healthier, place for movement? And if so, would you say, yeah, that's worth the fight? Or, you know what, it's actually worth, I would recommend you start something, separate from the legacy church in order to move in a healthier direction quicker.
Start to say the short answer is Chris, but
Yeah.
I read a book. It was a pre-print draft of a book that a guy asked me to read. Some of you know him, but I won't mention it at this moment. And he had walked through some of that same process. And the thing that I've come to, and then I'll share a specific example I've had. The thing I've come to is it's not exactly the Luke 10 person of peace principle, because that's talking about non-believers, but there's a similar thing. When you cast vision, and one of our field leaders puts it this way, she says, you move with the movers and you love the lingerers. And so there comes a point when you just have to say, guys, this is where I'm going. This is where the Lord has called this group. I hope you'll go with us, but if not, I've got to keep going. And so we joke, but in all seriousness, when I joined the organization, it was a random mission organization. We led it through a change process, and I tell people we grew it from 300 to 100. People just could not get it. I would tell people 10% change of what you're doing, and you'll be exponentially effective, and they could not get it because they would have to let go some things. So I've been working. There's a church here, ends up being one of our. It's where we landed when we moved back to States. Long, miraculous story, actually. And the previous pastor got it, put me in positions where I could influence conversations, even though my main job is the overseas, effort. New pastor comes along, great guy, really fun, we get along, but he has no clue. And I have invested, and I've given suggestions. I've handed him several books. And I've invited him to webinars. And again, he's very passionate. He's a personal evangelist, no question. Makes friends of rocks walking down the road. I mean, he's that friendly a guy. Wonderful guy, but he has no clue. And so finally I said to him, and I did it in all graciousness, and we're doing fine. I said, you know, hey guys, we're going to be, I just want you to know, y'all, this church supports us. I hope it continues to. We'll continue to help you any way we can, but we're going to be involved in house churches in DFW. Because I had kind of been being in their world on purpose to build relationships, and finally realized it was not going to be fruitful. The good part of that story is we were there long enough that 11 people came to us and said, would you train us in DMM? And all 11 of these folks are retired. And we're not only did we go through the first training, we're doing a weekly coaching thing. So we found those people who, continue to respond, and some of them are going to pull us into conversations with one of the new staff members that may be a key. So yeah, I finally had to say, I'm going to move with those that are moving, and some of them in the church are. We're going to bless the others, but I cannot be slowed down anymore.
Kent, that's great. Hey, in our last few minutes, Kent, would you tell them a little bit more about Beyond and how they can connect with you? So obviously some of them may just be, beginning to think about the nations and how to catalyze movements overseas. They're not really sure where to start. Some of them may have workers they're sending out and they're not really sure who to partner them up with. What would be the best way for them to either learn more about Beyond or connect with you guys in some way as it relates to their strategy to, like you were saying at the beginning, not only catalyze movements here, but overseas?
So Beyond is completely focused on catalyzing movements now. And I take Ralph Winter years ago, some of you know the name, wrote an article saying that the missionary team is the apostolic band of the church. I agree with Winter that the mission organization is not separate from the church. It's not parachurch. It's the apostolic band of the church. And so that is our philosophy. Not everybody is the hardcore, cross every boundary kind of apostle that, let's say, Paul was, but some apostles are Barnabas. Acts 14, Paul and Barnabas both called apostles. Some are more the nurturing, whatever, but they still have this big vision. So we work in teams. There's a lot of prerogative in team, but then there's shared consensus on bigger questions. So there's a lot of innovation at the team level. We try to build enough flexibility and enough structure that we can move forward together. I will tell you, I could spend hours telling you how people go out there. Well, we're just going to be on our own, or our church is our accountability structure. Folks, someone in Malaysia sending a missionary to Lebanon, actual situation of the church we're associated with, they don't know how to help that person be accountable. And he wasn't. They were too far removed. American churches who are the decision maker, it just doesn't work. So we work really hard to have a partnership where there are certain things that the local church says, we want to do these things, great. And there are certain things that the sending agency does with eLife. John Bradshaw has told their folks who are now with us, hey, as far as decisions and structures and accountability, you're Beyond. And then in other things we share, we keep John and Chris updated on some things. It's a wonderful partnership. We're finding real synergy there. Let me mention one thing that is really key. There are 1,400 something movements in the world, 2,000, maybe 3,000 other efforts to start movements that have not gotten to movement stage. What one of the things we're prioritizing is, are there people willing to go serve a movement and do whatever they ask? And while they do that, they're going to learn a whole lot about disciple making. That's scary. What do you mean, whatever they ask? We've got a young man who's going, he has tech skills like crazy. He's going to help them because they want to do something really sharp with computers and networking. No need to go into it. And so he's going, we're trying to figure out a name. We're calling it Movement Servant right now. And if some of you, if you've got engineers, you've got logistics people, I could tell you every kind of opportunity that if someone says, I'll go and do what the movement needs us to do so that the movement will spread, I'll do it. And that is one of the things we'll prioritize. I could show you any gifting set that we could find a way to maximize if they're willing to follow the lead of these experienced movement leaders. So we'd be glad to help partner with you and say, all right, which parts of the roles do you want to take? What part do we want to take? How are we going to help our personnel be effective in cross-cultural situations? Because it is different. And we stand ready to do that and are doing that.
Thank you, Kent, so much. Hey, I would encourage you guys, regardless of kind of what your church's posture is right now toward the nations, to maybe at least reach out to Kent or somebody on his team and just have a conversation about what some kind of a partnership could look like. So beyond.org is their website. And then if you email me, I can, email you with Kent copied so that you guys can chat as well. Would you guys give Kent a virtual round of applause, everybody? Thank you,
Thanks,
Kent.
Doug.
You're awesome.
Thank you. Really appreciate every one of you. Check out the videos. There are 3 videos with Chris on it, but I'm just saying. So so anyway.
Thanks, Kent. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks,
Glad
you
to have
guys. Really appreciate it. Blessings on you.
Yeah. Thank you.